Welcome back to our podcast. I'm the Disturbed Southern Belle.
And I'm the gentleman.
On this episode, we're going to be continuing on talking about some of the most disturbing human experimentation that's taken place throughout history. And this one is a good one. It is going to be talking about the Kamera experiments, or the poison laboratory of the Soviet secret services.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Sure, because you got to have a poison laboratory. So this laboratory, was also known as Laboratory 1, Laboratory 12, and Kamera, which means the cell in Russian. And it was a covert research and development facility of the Secret Service police agencies. Now, it operated prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and it manufactured and tested poisons. So,
Yay!
It was later reportedly reactivated by the Russian government sometime in the late 1990s, which is insane when you really stop to think about it, because, the 1990s. But anyway, so we're going to talk about a little chronology of the lab. So, starting in 1921, the first poison laboratory with the Soviet Secret Service was established, and it ran under the code name Special Office. It was operated by the Cheka, which was essentially the first Soviet secret police organization. And it was headed by a man named Ignaty Kazanov, who was a professor of medicine. Then in 1926, the laboratory operated under the supervision of Genrikh Yagoda, who was a deputy of the OGPU, which was another secret police organization, and he was deputy of the OGPU chairman Vyacheslav Menzhinsky. Now, Yagoda later became the NKVD chief after Menzhinsky's death, then in 1939. So, on February 20th of 1939, the lab became known as Laboratory 1, and it was headed by Grigory Marinovsky, and it ran under the direct supervision of the NKVD director, Laverty Biera, and his deputy, Vaslav Mirakulov. Then in 1953, on March 14th of 1953 to be exact, it was renamed to Laboratory 12. V. Naumov became the newly appointed head, and Laverty and Merkulov were executed after the death of Stalin. The NKVD supervisor of the laboratory, Pavel Sudopolavto, received a long term in prison. Then in 1978, it expanded into the Central Investigation Institute for Special Technology within the first chief directorate of the KGB. And then since 1991, several labs were responsible for the creation of biological and toxin weapons for operations in the West. So, still pretty recently, stuff was going down.
Yeah, which is very surprising.
It is, in a way.
It's not surprising that it happened. It's surprising that we know about it.
Yeah, that's true, too, because the Soviets are not known to be
No
telling
government
their
is.
stuff. Well, no, I'm not. Yeah, you're right. No government's just openly telling the stuff they're doing, but yeah.
Especially if it's stuff like this.
Right.
About weaponry and stuff.
Exactly. So we'll talk a little bit about the experimentation. So a variety of lethal poisons were tested on prisoners from the gulags. Now, if you don't know what that is, they were basically these forced labor prisons that were in the Soviet Union. So they were basically prisoners, they just took them out, and that's who they used as the main ones they tested on. And they tested some pretty ineffective poisons. Sure, we'll say that because it makes it sound better. They tested stuff like mustard gas, ricin, and if anybody's ever watched Breaking Bad, you've heard of ricin, digitoxin, curare, cyanide, as well as many others. So yeah, some of the main top poisons you can think of.
Yeah, those are definitely ineffective poisons.
Oh yeah, they've never been known to kill a single person, right? So, supposedly, the overall purpose of these experiments was to identify a tasteless and odorless chemical that could not be detected post-mortem, meaning it would not be identified as a resulting cause of death during an autopsy, which is scary.
Absolutely.
There's
absolutely poisons out there that can do that.
It's scary.
And it's terrifying to think of it.
It's scary, right? The poisons were given to victims usually along with a meal or drink, and they were given under the disguise of it being medication. Witnesses later testified about the use of carbalamine choline chloride, which was developed and referred to as C2 or K2. So according to witness testimonies, the victims would experience physical changes such as a rapid overall weakening, which would be expected. But this one's kind of odd. They would also experience a diminishment in their height.
That's a bit weird.
That is odd. This would be followed by a calm and silent demeanor, which would eventually culminate in the victim's death after approximately 15 minutes. So not too shortly acting there.
No.
I mean, bam, it's going pretty good.
This is a very weird poison.
It is.
I've never heard of anything that can make you smaller.
Now, I don't know if it's maybe making you draw up and make you look smaller. Maybe that's what they meant.
Either way, it's kind of weird.
It is.
And interesting.
It is. So victims were of various ages and physical conditions in order to get a more detailed account of how each individual poison impacted an individual, of course. Victims were then also simply sometimes just executed with the poisons that were created under the order of the government and stuff, different ones.
Because of course they were.
So, yeah. Now, we're going to talk a few about some of the more prominent supposed victims that were killed by the poisons that were developed there or whatever. So, in 1930, the leader of the Russian All-Military Union, General Alexander Kutupov, he was drugged and kidnapped while in Paris. And then he later died from a heart attack due to an overdose of an administered poison. Then in 1937, another leader of the White Movement and head of the Russian All-Military Union, General Evgeny Miller, was also drugged and kidnapped while in Paris, and he was later executed in Russia. So apparently, don't go to Paris during that. Then in 1940, a famous Russian biologist, Nikolai Kostsov, Sy-Oggins, he's actually somebody who's actually kind of well known, who was an American-born spy for the Russian secret police, and he was taken to the lab where Gregory Marinovsky then injected him with curare, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about what some of these poisons do, and they're not pleasant here in a moment. In 1947, Archbishop Theodore Ramza of the Ukrainian Catholic Church was also killed by curare, which was provided by Marinovsky and then administered by a nurse who was a ministry for the state secret agent. So there's a lot of covert crap going on back then.
Yeah.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a Nobel Prize laureate, was poisoned with what was later determined to be ricin. However, he did survive his attempt. But, now this one was a crazy one. In 1978, Bulgarian writer Grigory Markov was assassinated while in London when a tiny pellet, which was fired from an umbrella gun that had been poisoned with ricin, hit him.
An umbrella gun.
An umbrella gun. Shot him with this little pellet, and it killed him.
That's a spy weapon if I ever heard one.
Yeah, for real, right? It is crazy. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the effects of some of the main poisons that, that they tested. So we'll talk first about mustard gas. So mustard gases have powerful blistering effects on victims, and they usually don't produce immediate symptoms, and contaminated areas may even appear to be normal areas. But normally within about 24 hours of exposure, victims will begin to experience severe, intense itching and skin irritation, which sounds fun.
Absolutely.
If that irritation is not treated, the blisters will begin to fill with pus, which will form on the areas of the skin where the agent, of course, contacted the skin. The chemical burns, as expected, can be horribly debilitating. If the victim's eyes are exposed, they can become sore, which can then develop into conjunctivitis, which is better known as pink eye. The eyelids will then swell to the point of temporary blindness because they can't even open their eyes, and then all the gunk in it and everything. However, more extreme exposure can cause corneal ulceration, and of course much, much worse. If inhaled, it causes bleeding and blistering within the respiratory system. So, I don't know if you know this, that's not a place where you want to be blistered or bleeding.
No, it doesn't seem like it is.
Which, of course, it damages the mucous membranes and causes pulmonary edema, which is basically the buildup of fluid in your lungs. And so, depending on the level of contamination, mustard agents can burns between first and third degree burns on the skin. Now, here's where it kind of gets crazy. So 80% of the agent that comes in contact with the skin evaporates. 10% stays in the skin, and the last 10% is then absorbed and circulated in your blood. So awful.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
So next is ricin, and it's a very toxic poison, and it can be inhaled, injected, or ingested. It acts as a toxin by inhibiting protein synthesis in the body. And so, because of how the toxin acts on the body, it may take hours or even days for symptoms to first appear. However, this mainly depends on the method of the exposure to the poison. So, if it's ingested, gastrointestinal symptoms will normally happen within around 6 hours. So, if you eat it in some way or whatever, it's going to happen faster because it gets in your stomach. Then, within 2 to 5 days after exposure, it begins to impact the central nervous system, your adrenal glands, your kidneys, and your liver.
Fun.
So, yeah, none of those do you really need, so it should be fine, right?
Nah.
Ingestion will, of course, cause pain, inflammation, and hemorrhaging to the membranes in the gastrointestinal system. And these symptoms then quickly progress, of course, to severe nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and difficulty swallowing. And then, of course, there will also be the presence of bloody feces as well as vomiting blood. Then, the low blood volume caused by gastrointestinal fluid loss can then lead to organ failure in the pancreas, kidney, liver, and GI tract, and progress to basically shock. Shock and organ failures are usually indicated by disorientation, stupor, weakness, drowsiness, excessive thirst, low urine production, and bloody urine. So, yay, all that sounds like a wonderful drug to have in your system.
Absolutely, yes, it does.
Next is the digitoxin, and it can exhibit similar toxic effects to digoxin, which can include anorexia, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, confusion, visual disturbances, and cardiac arrhythmias, which are essentially irregular heartbeats. So, it doesn't sound like it'd hurt you that much, right?
Nah.
Yeah, whatever. There are drugs that can be used to increase the toxicity of this drug, which, ironically enough, here's some of them. Calcium can be used to increase the toxicity of this drug. Calcium. Substances that can lower potassium or magnesium levels, such as a diuretic, or inhibitors of the liver enzyme known as CYP3A4, as well as others, can actually make this thing even more potent. Now, there's some that can make it less potent, but, that's what they weren't really what they were testing for. So, curare, it is essentially a toxin that can cause muscle paralysis when it enters the bloodstream. Sounds fun, right? Nothing like muscle paralysis. So, It blocks the neuromuscular transmission, which is the process that allows the central nervous system to control the movement of muscles.
Fun.
Now, if it's used on a poison arrow kind of scenario, now people actually use this to hunt in different parts of like Africa and things like that. They would actually put this on their weapons, like arrows and spears and stuff. So if it's used like a poison arrow, if you swallow it, usually there's no poisoning. However, if it gets injected into the skin or gets, embedded somehow, it causes the inability to move. And it usually starts like you get a headache. And this happens pretty fast, too. Then it's like vertigo, where you start feeling dizzy, vision's blurred. Then hypotension, which is like the lowering of your blood pressure. Then you get a gradual paralysis of your limbs, followed by the paralysis of your respiratory muscles. And then so you basically die from asphyxia. So
in other words, a whole bunch of really pleasant stuff.
Yeah, so you're just slowly becoming paralyzed to the point that you can't even draw a breath. Ugh.
This is terrifying.
It is. Now, the last one we'll talk about is cyanide. Now, early symptoms include headache, dizziness, accelerated heart rate, shortness of breath, and vomiting, which could be 1,000 things. It may then be followed by seizures, low heart rate, loss of consciousness, and cardiac arrest. Onset of symptoms normally happen within a few minutes, and anybody who survives it, normally they have long-term neurological issues. So, all these poisons were absolutely horrific, and God knows how many people that they experimented on, and I guess in the big scheme, I don't know that it matters even if it happened to one or if it happened to them. It's bad.
It still happened. It's still
horrible.
Something that a bunch of humans did to a bunch of other humans.
Exactly. So, that'll wrap up this episode, and we hope you enjoyed this segment. Well, as much as you can hear about these types of things, I guess we should say. But, as we said before, we don't want to sweep everything under the rug. We do, the victims of these acts do deserve to be remembered at the very least,
yes,
that this happened to them. And hopefully this will help us never to repeat them again. But anyway, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. And don't forget to
stay disturbed.